Declaration enough for Flint? Should there be more investigations or hearings at the federal level? And with the recent resignations and an I'm sorry, has the governor done enough? There is a lot to talk about. So let's bring in Nolan Finley. He's the editorial page editor of the Detroit News. Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Happy New Year, guys.
Yeah.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
And enough to talk about this week. It was hard to decide what the lead was going to be, but I think you have to go into Flint. And what I find fascinating about this situation and the ongoing crisis is that I feel that there's been a lot of peaks and valleys, and it finally reached a crescendo in October when the state finally intervened, switched the water system back, and said we have a problem here, acknowledged that there was a problem, and then it got quiet for a little while, and then the national media picked up on it, which I thought was interesting that it took them so long. And then you had the governor come out right after Christmas apologizing. You had his task force come back with some news, and you had the head of the DEQ resign. So Nolan, what do you make of where we are right now with the state of emergency being called?
Well, as George W. Bush learned in Louisiana after Katrina, it's hard to recover from a late start. And the governor got a late start in publicly responding to this and presenting himself as very concerned, very urgent in this matter. And I think it's going to take a lot of catch-up now on his part to establish himself as a guy who is in control of this situation and who takes this situation seriously. I believe he does, but I think the fact that he sort of relied on his MDEQ department for so long and apparently got such bad information from him is really going to hurt.
Do you think that he made the right moves when he needed to make them?
Not when he needed to make them. I mean, it's all very late. It's all extremely late. I mean, when you go back through the emails and the records and you see at what point the Department of Environmental Quality understood that the chemical that needed to be added to the water to stop it from stripping the lead from the pipes hadn't been in there. That's a long time ago, and they spent a long time denying that they knew or denying that this was taking place. So it all comes extremely late, and what I have a hard time with is coming up with what the consequences should be as a result of this. I mean, on the one hand, you have this human rights crisis in Flint now. All of these children in particular who have been poisoned by the water, and there's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done to deal with that. On the other hand, there's got to be some sort of consequences, I feel like, for the people who did not do their jobs or who willfully ignored the information to let this happen and go on for as long as.
Do you think there should be some kind of criminal charges?
Well, I don't know, but I do think you need to demonstrate that you're going to institute a culture change in the MDEQ. I mean, there were some serious mistakes made there, serious neglect, oversights, what have you. But it becomes very apparent that they were doing everything they could to dismiss the seriousness of this issue. That doesn't start with the director. I mean, Dan Wyatt, I'm not sure how much he knew or what he was getting from his staff, but that's all down through an organization. I think you need systemic change there, and you've got to demonstrate that this is not the same MDEQ who's going to address the next crisis.
I think the specter of possible criminal liability has actually somewhat been overblown. I mean, we actually looked into this at the Free Press a couple of months ago. What was the possibility? And the criminal side of EPA regulations, it requires all kinds of stuff that you just don't, at this point, see here. But the civil liability here could be through the roof. And I suspect that is what the U.S. Attorney in Detroit is looking into with the EPA, is what are the civil actions that can be taken as a consequence.
Which is interesting because they never usually confirm any investigation that they are working on. But they said because so many people have been calling and asking, so you're thinking it's some kind of civil thing.
Beyond punishment, I think we have to be certain as a state and the people who live here that this department, this administration can respond the next time in an appropriate manner. And I think that's what makes these investigations most useful, figuring out what the heck went wrong and what preventative steps need to be put in place.
Yeah, because the testing isn't over. And I think that's what's also concerning is that no one can say for sure that the Flint water now, the fact that they've rehooked up to the Detroit pipeline, that it's safe now to drink.
Well,
and they're waiting for some more tests to come in on
They'll have
that.
to test it, but you don't have the same issue with the DWSD water supply that you did. The problem here was the high levels of corrosive material in the Flint River. Pollutants that are there from years of industry along that river, and they get into the pipes and they leach the lead out of lead pipes. DWSD is not drawing from that same water source, so it doesn't have those same issues. We don't have to add chemicals to the water here to stop that from happening. So that should correct the problem. And you think of it this way. Flint had DWSD service for years and years and years before this, and lead levels in children in Flint had been going down for a long time. And also remember, it's not just water that poisons children with lead. There are lots of other environmental issues in cities like Flint where lead poisoning is an issue. But we had been seeing that go down for a long time in Flint, even as they were getting water from DWSD. So I think that is a solution. It may take some time to prove that through the.
But there's no solution for the kids who are already poisoned. I mean, that's irreversible.
You've got to go back.
And that's the big thing. So now that we're looking at this, I guess, state of emergency that has been declared, and that eases the way for potential funding to come from the state, and eventually, should they need it, from the federal government. And I think that's the looking down the road here, Nolan, is what kind of funding is going to be needed in the short term and in the long term to be able to help a community that has been damaged by this, and we will not be able to know what the fallout is for years to come.
Well, I mean, the first thing you got to do is make sure that the infrastructure is right. You don't want to be finding out 5 years from now that lead is still leaching out of those pipes. You also have to, on a broader sense, have to figure out where else we're vulnerable in Michigan to this sort of disaster because of an aging infrastructure all over the state. Our pipes, our sewer systems are in just a mess. They're old, they need repair.
Bridge Magazine had a really interesting graphic a couple of weeks ago about cities in Michigan where children's lead levels are even higher than what we've seen in Flint. And there was a lot of dots on that map. And again, that's not about the water necessarily. That's about these other things, about houses that get knocked down that have lead in them still, or other things. Lead dust is really the most lethal and problematic issue with that. And you see that in cities all over the state. So you're right that it's not just about the water in Flint. It is about aging infrastructure, getting rid of aging things, and dealing with lead abatement in a way that makes some sense.
All right, before we leave this topic, I want to throw out, I guess, also the national attention it's been getting, and specifically from now you've got Michael Moore, filmmaker from Flint, who is calling for the governor to be arrested and prosecuted. You had inflammatory tweets from Cher, and I never thought I'd say that on this show. I never thought I'd mention Cher on MiWeek. But I want you guys to briefly touch upon what you think or perceive to be the national attention to this story.
Well, I mean, it's obviously not a positive story for Michigan. It's an image hit. It's an image hit to the governor, I think, in particular. You know, and when you start getting sort of the lunatic fringe out there calling for hangings and executions, it just escalates the negative impact of this story on Michigan and on the Snyder administration.
Last word from you.
It's a disaster from a national standpoint. I mean, you think of the coverage that we're getting, and again, I'm really careful to keep trying to put the focus back on the victims here. I mean, you're talking about children whose lives will be altered for the rest of their lives because of this. I mean, Michael Moore, Cher, whatever. I mean, they're going to say what they want to say. They want to arrest the governor. They want to execute him. Fine, whatever. Really, the issue is how do we help these kids who have been victimized by this and do something to make their lives a little better in the future.
Yeah, kids who had no choice in the matter. All right.